Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to another Patch Tuesday. Let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we're going to go through just a quick update on what's going on in the July Patch Tuesday specific to the content that we are deploying out. The recent news that we're going to be going over, there's a couple of things that definitely are worth noting there. And then Todd is going to walk us through all the bulletins and releases and wrap up with what we call between the Patch Tuesdays. So as you'll see in the news, we often talk about things leading up to Patch Tuesday or what happens in between there, because a lot of big things happen not on Patch Tuesday as well. So we'll talk about a few of those, and Todd will do just a recap of the Windows third-party apps that have released in between Patch Tuesdays, and also the Mac OS updates and Mac third-party apps that released between the Patch Tuesdays. And on that note then, the July update covers Adobe. They had a number of releases. We're going to be covering 5 of those specific to the Creative Suite that we cover in our patch catalog, and the 6 updates from Microsoft that are going to be the core focus of the updates we're covering today. The topics in the news before we jump into that, though, first off, there is another Google Chrome 0 Day. The update released for this one on June 30th. So Chrome and Edge both had updates that needed to be deployed last week leading up to Patch Tuesday. So we just wanted to make sure people are aware of that. Do be sure to make sure that your browser updates are all getting in place with your regular maintenance there. If you're not doing a more aggressive update schedule for the browsers, we just want to make sure that's on your radar for keeping up to date there. Those of you who were on last month, you remember the lead up between May and June Patch Tuesday. We had 5 weeks of pretty intense back-to-back browser updates. So if you did not see last month's webinar, check that out on the Patch Tuesday page. You'll see the June update. You'll be able to go back and look at that. I had a slide that kind of laid out the 5 weeks and what all happened in there, including 2 other Chrome 0 Days and some Firefox notables that came up in a hacker competition. So browsers in general, expect that you have something to do on a weekly basis for those of you using our Neurons for Patch Management Cloud solution, you know that we've been designing certain features around focusing on more frequent priority updates for applications like browsers, independent of your regular monthly maintenance as well. So you may do your monthly, OS update and any third-party apps that need to go at the same time there, but we highly suggest you should be configuring for more aggressive remediation of some of these third-party apps that upgrade much more continuously, especially the browsers, for good reason.
Chris, one point you might make here, Chris, is there actually was a Chrome release yesterday. We don't have it here in the presentation because it didn't address any specific CVEs like they called out. But as Chris mentioned, these are all cumulative, so it does address the 0 days that they've had over the last couple of weeks. So make sure, even though we're not calling it out here specifically in the presentation day, there was a Chrome release yesterday. Same thing for Firefox. They also released the Firefox release. So just stay on top of those. Just want to call that out.
A good question that came in. When it comes to browsers like Edge, Firefox, Chrome, does that require a computer restart? No, it does not require a computer restart. The browser may need to be restarted, and that's a fairly minimal interruption for the user. I mean, the browser experience is now, you can pretty much recover what your last browser session was with a single click. So it's pretty lightweight to get back up and running there. So we recommend that more frequent task be one that you don't necessarily have to do a reboot with. You can have it set to reboot only if necessary, or not do a reboot at all if you're doing applications like the browsers that don't require a system restart. So that is definitely highly suggested, though, making sure that you get the browser updates happening more frequently. There are many third-party applications that continuously update. They are on a third party, or the third-party apps, very few do a consistent schedule like Patch Tuesday. Adobe is one of the few. Browsers release pretty much whenever they're ready. Other applications like the Zoom or different applications like that, all just as soon as they're ready, they release. Even Apple doesn't have a consistent release schedule. They release about every 3 to 5 weeks. Most vendors do a continuous release cycle, not a set schedule. So that's where we try to encourage people to consider that in their scheduling of their maintenance, because many of the things that are happening outside of Patch Tuesday. And Todd's going to show that towards the end of today's session. The first article that we're going to talk about is the Google 0 Day. It's the fourth this year. Like I said, we had 2 between May and June and 1 more prior to that earlier this year. This talks a little bit about the version that was updated, when it was updated, and a little bit of detail about the particular vulnerability here. So a good read on that. But just it's a good idea to make sure to use this information to educate stakeholders within your organization if you need to get more frequent update tracks for specific applications outside of your regular maintenance. This morning, here it is. At the end of the article, they also talk about a 2024 recap. Google had patched a total of 10 zero-day vulnerabilities that were either exploited in attacks or demoed during the Pwn2Own hacking competitions. So if you were on last month's event, we talked about the Firefox release that was directly related to the Pwn2Own Berlin competition. Pwn2Own is definitely watched by a lot of the vendors, but also bad actors will be watching that as well. And the things that are exploited there become interesting topics of discussion for all parties involved. So a lot of the vendors will jump on those vulnerabilities very quickly to try to resolve those. But this will give you kind of a good idea of how frequently these things are happening. Again, if you go back to last month's Patch Tuesday webinar, you'll see that as well. Browsers, at the very least, should be something that you're doing at least on a weekly, if not setting up for a daily task to go and look to see if there's any browsers updates available. That makes it so that you just make sure to catch those as frequently as possible. Most of you are not sitting there watching the news every morning to see if there's a new 0-day in Chrome. It's not something that you have time for. So having solutions like ours in place to be able to keep these updates coming in frequently and being able to configure the product to remediate those as they come up and do so very quickly, that's something that we're trying to make very easy out-of-the-box configurations for. So take a look at the different options you have for being able to do that. All right. Next topic. This is one that if you go into the docs section, this will be one of the links that I made available there. So this was kind of a stealth update that Microsoft made in May. They announced at the very end of May that they were going to be making some update channel release changes for Office 365 apps. So this is just a heads up in case you did not see that information before. Microsoft has a couple of changes of note. The monthly enterprise channel will have rollback support extending out to 2 months. So, hey, we got 2 months now instead of 1 month for rollback support for that. That makes it so that you can better manage that if you do run into a breaking change, then you had to roll back. It gives you a little bit more of a breathing room before that change is kind of forced on you. The semi-annual channel or the semi-annual enterprise channel preview is being deprecated. So that you should be, any devices who are on that preview channel, you should be migrating off of that as soon as possible. And the semi-annual enterprise channel is decreasing support from 14 months to 8 months. So that the semi-annual channel is probably where the most changes are happening there. But that article just walks through some more details about the changes, the recommendations that Microsoft is making. If you are using anything other than just the monthly enterprise channel, do take a read on that and make sure that you're familiar with the changes that are occurring. Next, we have the public disclosure. This month, there was one public disclosure. Good news is there's no 0-day exploits on the Microsoft side this month, but there was one publicly disclosed vulnerability. And what that means is enough information has been shared publicly about this vulnerability prior to Microsoft remediating it, that threat actors have a jump start on trying to investigate this if they were going to choose to exploit it. In this case, probably low risk. I would not see any telltale signs in this publicly disclosed vulnerability that would warrant it being treated as a critical instead of an important. The code maturity for this is unproven, so the disclosure did not include any code samples or anything like that. There is some complexity. It's low, but there's some complexity in taking advantage of this. But a threat actor would still have to do the research to figure out what exactly to do to take advantage of this. So in this case, they did, I don't know when they changed it, but they made a change to the text in here to change it from the language that it was, which was a little bit obscure, to much more clear. If you're running SQL on your system, what action do you need to take? You need to update the relevant version of SQL. Any applicable driver fixes are included in that SQL update. So that was just the original writing of that FAQ question was a little bit ambiguous. And if any of you saw Susan Bradley on patchmanagement.org, she even responded to that, showing the original text and the updated text. And it was very clear that this was a much cleaner description of that. So don't know what they were doing there originally when they wrote that, but this got updated to be a little bit more clear on that. So there were a few driver changes involved in this month's SQL update and several other CVEs that were resolved, but the disclosure was one of those. All right. I don't think there was any other major notes in here that are needing to be called out. If you're following along in the slide deck, we're jumping down to the Ivanti July security updates. We had 3 security updates released this month. So Ivanti Connect Secure and Policy Secure, Ivanti EPMM, and Ivanti EPM. No known exploits or any exploits in the wild or anything regarding any of these vulnerabilities. There were a total of, I believe, 11 CVEs resolved across the 3 different products. But if you're running any of those 3 products, you can go to the links that we've provided in the presentation, or you can go out to blog.ivanti.com and go to our security advisory section and check out the July post here, which has links to the 3 security advisory pages, which will have links and information about how to get access to the updates, what versions to update to, and so forth. Next, we've got the Linux vulnerabilities that, for those of you who have been on previous Patch Tuesday webinars, we have a partnership with a vendor called TuxCare who specializes in Linux update capabilities. Their focus is around live patching. So those of you familiar with kind of the recent Microsoft edition of live patching, this is actually a step better than that. Their ability is they can patch the kernel and certain very critical, components of the Linux systems without having to reboot. It's basically patching in memory. It doesn't have the limitations of like Microsoft's live patching, where it's like, oh, hey, yeah, you've got to get on board with the live patching at the beginning of that window. And if you have to revert back for any reason, then you can't start doing live patching again until the next window starts, that sort of thing. No limitations like that in the TuxCare approach for the Linux side. It literally is a, ability to patch the in-memory RPMs that are being used by the Linux system so that you can, not have to do that reboot cycle. Now, it's not recommended to run that way indefinitely. This is a means to be able to do that type of operational execution. You don't have to do a reboot as frequently. And then periodically, whether you do it quarterly or in some time period, you should be going back and doing a full update of those systems to get those patches in place. But it's an interesting approach to being able to reduce the impact on operational maintenance windows. They give us a little bit of detail on some of the notable security vulnerabilities on the Linux side. And the first 2 that we're going to talk about this month are CVE 2025-6018 and 6019. This was an interesting write-up on these that I found on LinkedIn. Taz, the writer of this one, is a longtime cybersecurity incident responder and focuses a lot on the Linux side especially. He does a really good job of talking about these vulnerabilities, but I really thought it was important to, touch on his initial statements here. One common misconception in the cybersecurity space is, hey, it's Linux, it's secure. I don't have to worry about it. It just keeps running. It's great. Well, no, Taz is very clear here. There is no such thing as a secure OS, a secure application. There's always need for, things to be updated, for things to be resolved. The Linux world has its own challenges when it comes to that. These 2 vulnerabilities show how bad it can get. If used together, the attacker is able to compromise a SUSE Linux distribution and gain root access. At that point, you pretty much own a Linux system. Now, several other Linux distributions also have this pair of vulnerabilities on there. In the other cases, he stated that you weren't able to get full root access, but you were able to compromise the system pretty extensively if you were able to compromise these two vulnerabilities together. So he talks about the attack in general. He also refers to the fact that it's very similar to a number of other rootkits and malware and botnets that have been used in the past. So he's suggesting here that this pair is a pair that you really want to get resolved in a timely fashion. So don't let these sit out there, because it's a very interesting combo for a threat actor to try to target. It lets them do some pretty extensive, widespread attacks. So that's the first pair of CVEs. The second slide is talking about CVE 2023-0386. And if you didn't see the CISA KEV updates from June, this one got added to the CISA KEV list just last month. So that means that it's rising the charts for frequent attacks, definitely being used by threat actors. So one that you really want to get put in place as well. The third slide that we've got in there is, I'll jump back over to the presentation now. So this was the first pair we talked about on slide 8. And then we talked about the one that was just recently added to the CISA KEV list in June, actively being exploited. The third one is another one that's definitely notable, affecting a number of Linux distributions, Ubuntu, Debian, and Red Hat, upgrading to version 25.1.3 of the, was this one a kernel update, or it doesn't specify if it's a kernel update or which piece getting updated gets to that resolution.
Yeah, I don't think they called that out, Chris.
Yeah, usually they call out specific. The Cloud Init utility automates the initialization of cloud instances. It sounds like a system level component, but let me see if I can find out exactly if it's kernel or if it's something else on this specifically. 46174. Sorry, normally they've got a little bit more detail in their write-ups on exactly which component we're talking about. This one seems a little vague. I can't read Russian or Chinese, so those don't help me. Sorry, I'm just looking for an article here that gives a better representation of this. Just says Cloud Init is the component that they're talking about in every case, but it's not saying exactly which component you need to bring up to that version to resolve the vulnerability. Is it the kernel or is it something else? Unfortunately, that looks a little bit vague, so I apologize. I don't have a solid answer on exactly which component needs to be updated on that one. All right. So, but that's the Linux lineup for this month. The first two sets there, definitely make sure that you're getting those resolved as quickly as possible. Both of those are kernel related. The other is, I think, kernel related as well, but not 100% positive on that. Many of the articles I was looking at, because of the nature of that one, it's affecting a lot of WAF and IDS systems as well. So they're just saying update their version of software to the latest, but for a standard, system that's not a specific, like appliance or anything from a vendor. I'm not seeing a specific, it's a kernel vulnerability, or you update the kernel to resolve it, or you update this component to resolve it. Those I'm not seeing a specific answer to. All right. There were a number of developer updates this month. Azure had two components that had vulnerabilities in them, the Azure Monitor Agent and the Service Fabric. Both of those should auto-update unless you have specifically disabled auto-update features within your Azure instance. So that will be, the key there is if you're having those components auto-update, you're good. If you don't have those auto-updating, if you've disabled that, there is steps that you would need to proceed to push that update out to those components. And then there were a number of Visual Studio CVEs, including 7 that were released through MITRE for Git. But the Visual Studio update is the update you need to apply to resolve all of the Visual Studio update vulnerabilities, including the 7 from Git this month. So your development teams have some things to take a look at, and your operations teams, depending on your configuration in Azure, may have some actions to take care of there as well.
Yeah, Chris, one thing I didn't list
Yep.
there actually was a fix for Visual Studio 2015. Apologize for that. It was listed at the very bottom of the list, but there was a fix. If you're still building you have to build some old software with an old version of Visual Studio, 2015 actually had a patch as well.
Got it. As I was going through that first news article, I missed one of the important ones. Todd's going to talk about this in the update as well, potentially, but I wanted to make sure to call out the fact that last month there was a known issue that was discovered shortly after people started doing the updates. For those of you who encountered the DHCP service stopping after the June update was applied, Microsoft did resolve that, and they released, this was the message that was released by the Windows Health notification system, if you're subscribed to that, showing the different server editions, the original KB and the resolved KB. So more confirmation, though, that that issue should be resolved. If you encountered the issue last month and you had to roll back, ideally, you would want to just make sure that you apply the OS update to some of those systems that were affected last month, check and make sure everything's good, and then continue to roll out. But the initial responses I've been seeing from patchmanagement.org as of today, people are acknowledging that this is fixed. Nobody is raising their arm, right now saying, oh my God, nope, still not fixed or anything. So it looks good for the moment. But anybody who did encounter that issue, approach with a little bit more caution than normal, but you should be good to go. Just wanted to make sure to touch on that because I forgot to before. ESU support. So Windows 10 lifecycle, we are rapidly approaching October. If you don't already have a plan in place, and if you are expecting to have some Windows 10 server or systems go beyond the end of life date, October is the last security update unless you subscribe to ESU support. So make sure you've got your plans in place either to transition off of or continue support for Windows 10 past October. And just some details again we've been talking about this most months here for the past several months, just making sure people are aware. But if you are using an Ivanti solution, you subscribe to the Microsoft ESU, and then you would contact us and get support in place for that. Again, there is a cost involved. It's an operational cost on our side. It's a fraction of what it is when you're paying Microsoft for the coverage. And we do try to scale that back with how many systems you're managing. So contact your account rep if you need to do ESU support and you're using one of our Ivanti patch management solutions to manage that. We can provide that content, but you do also have to subscribe to Microsoft. Their cost doubles every year. Ours stays consistent throughout, again, just because we need to cover the operational cost of maintaining the environments, doing the testing, and making that available to our customers. So long-term service channel, anybody on the LTSC, nothing near-term to be concerned about there. Looks like the extended support, mainstream support end, we had Server 2016 mainstream had ended. That's out to 2027 for extended support. And then Server 2019 1809 mainstream support ended in 2024, and the extended support is out to 2029. So a little ways out before any of those fully end of life. All right, Todd, over to you for the bulletins and releases.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let's walk through what we saw yesterday as far as releases go. Chris did mention that there were a number of updates for Creative Cloud and some of the applications that we cover in there. First of all, an important update for Adobe After Effects. They addressed two vulnerabilities in there. These are denial of service and a memory leak vulnerability. They only rated this one as important. And important to note here that all the Adobe releases I'm going to talk about, none of these have known exploits against them right now that are reported by Adobe that they're aware of. So just important to keep them up to date as your regular Creative Cloud suite update. Similarly, there was a denial of service update for the Adobe Edition application. Again, two versions supported, and most of these are 2024 and 2025 releases, by the way. I call out the specific version numbers. I pulled them out of the bulletins for everybody's use here, but usually they're 2024 and 2025 releases. More importantly, there was an update for InCopy. It did address 3 critical vulnerabilities that allowed for, they call it arbitrary code execution. Again, important one from an Adobe InCopy standpoint. InDesign as well, a few more vulnerabilities. Again, 6 of them here. called out that are critical. These all had to do with arbitrary code execution as well. And one thing you keep in mind, these updates are for both the Windows and the Mac OS versions that are out there. So important to keep those up to date. Adobe Illustrator, a common program used by a lot of us. 10 vulnerabilities in this particular release. I didn't list all the CVEs specifically. You can go in and take a look at those. They did lead to arbitrary code execution, denial of service, and a memory leak, as they call them out. 7 critical, 3 rated important. So those of you that are using Illustrator want to make sure that you update it as well. Getting into the updates for the operating system specifically from Microsoft yesterday, we did, of course, see the Windows 11 update that included Server 2025. Large number of vulnerabilities, 102 addressed yesterday. Despite that, as Chris said, none of them were known to be exploited or publicly disclosed, so we didn't have any 0 days there. But again, a large number, and a few of them are critical, as expected, which raises this up to a critical level. So you want to make sure you're updating your operating systems as well. Interestingly, no known reported issues across Windows 11 or Server 2025 this month. So that's nice to know. Windows 10, now fewer vulnerabilities than Windows 11 as it's approaching end of life, maybe just a focus issue, but only 97, still a large number, of course, were addressed this month. Again, none of those known exploited or publicly disclosed either. As far as known issues, there was one reported. Now, this is interesting because I looked in the release notes from Microsoft, and they listed multiple versions of Windows 10 having issues, but actually looking at the KBs themselves, there was only one that was called out. And this is an issue we talked about last month. It was a font issue with the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean fonts being displayed properly. These came over from Google, by the way. These are Chromium-based fonts that were pulled in from the Chrome browser. Looks like Microsoft is kind of punting on this one. They said, yeah, if you have any issues with this, deal with Google. You can write to them on their GitHub repository notes if you want to comment on this. Their workaround for right now, and probably going to stay this way through the end of Windows 10, is increase your scaling so that they're displayed in a little bit larger capability, and they won't be quite so blurry. So it's kind of their workaround right now. This was resolved apparently in Windows 11, and this is the only one that they're calling out right now in Windows 10. Again, this is the 2021 releases and 22H2 releases, so be aware of that one. It's the only known issue, so not too many this month. Chris talked about SQL Server. I specifically highlighted here the publicly disclosed vulnerability 2025-49719. 2 other vulnerabilities were also addressed in this release, so there were 3. These are all the currently supported versions of SQL Server. So going back to 2016 Service Pack 3, we did talk about 2017, both the original release and the cumulative updates, 2019, and finally 2022. So again, these 3 vulnerabilities rated, the one obviously publicly disclosed, so it is a critical update this month if you're running any of these versions of SQL Server. No known reported issues, which is nice. We did see an update, of course, for SharePoint Server as well. 4 vulnerabilities addressed this month. Several of these allow remote code execution. One of them allowed for spoofing capabilities. The standard 3 we see every month, 2016, SharePoint Server 2019, and their subscription edition. So those are the 3 that are in active support. Usually a pretty straightforward update on SharePoint Server. No known issues this month as well. Of course, on the Office side, we did see a lot of Office 2016 updates yesterday, and there were a large number of patches. If you've seen our patch release that came out last night, they did address 14 vulnerabilities, and you can see that a lot of the individual applications were patched all the way from Excel through Word, as well as the Office suites themselves, of course, had the updates. Again, 14 vulnerabilities. This one's rated critical as well. Want to make sure that you do update this one. None of these are known, exploited, or publicly disclosed. Again, the only one this month was on SQL Server. And finally, the Office 365 apps. These are the click-to-run updates, pretty straightforward. As Chris mentioned, some changes in the update channels this month. He showed you that slide earlier. These kind of stealth announcement from Microsoft. But if you do update your apps this month, you want to make sure this is critical. So get those updates out there. 13 vulnerabilities, 1 less than the on-premise or the standalone 2016 version. We did talk about between the Patch Tuesdays. It has been a little bit slower month than usual. So I have a master list here of what we released on the Windows side. These are the updates with patches that include CVEs. I have a list of those here on the next couple of slides. A lot of times the vendors will release security updates. They call them security updates and don't necessarily include CVE information, but they have said that there are some security fixes in those. So we include those as well. And finally, non-security updates are generally performance, bug fixes, etc. We did see an update for 7-zip 24. By the way, version 25 is out now as well. So be aware of that one. But there was a fix last month for one vulnerability. The usual weekly Chrome updates. Chris talked about the browsers quite a bit earlier. This is basically one a week. If you're looking at these, again, the one back on the 30th here is the 6554 was that 0-day vulnerability. Again, that's included in the release of Chrome that came out yesterday as well. So you want to make sure you update to the latest version as usual. We did see updates for Docker for Windows. Of course, Firefox followed suit with their usual browser updates, both their standard version 140. And oh, by the way, take a look here on the bottom here. I was kind of surprised by this and double checked with the content team. Version 140 is now available in ESR form. So they're rolling their extended support versions very quickly. So 140 just came out not too long ago, and it's already in ESR for extended support. So be aware of that one. A couple of other updates on the Windows side. We saw updates for Notepad, several updates for Opera, PyCharm Professional as well. So PyCharm Community, single vulnerabilities there. We saw an update for Python, some Thunderbird updates, and finally Apache Tomcat. So make sure you're keeping up with all those. These are, again, between the Patch Tuesdays, released during the month. Not as many updates on the Apple side this month. It's been kind of quiet. As far as security updates go, we saw the usual matching updates from the Windows side to the Apple side for Chrome. Same 3 updates, same vulnerabilities addressed. And we saw that update for Firefox as well, running on Mac OS. Firefox ESR versions, and of course, Microsoft Edge. Again, these vulnerabilities typically match up pretty well, almost directly with the Chrome updates. And so we did see these Edge updates come out throughout the month as well for running on Apple, and finally Thunderbird 140. So all these updates throughout the month between the Patch Tuesdays. With that kind of wraps up the presentation for today. Let's go and take a look.